I had a promise to keep. I could still feel the weight of it pressing against my chest as I carried the last box up the narrow staircase of her apartment building. Promises weren't supposed to feel like lead, but the moment I saw her, leaning casually against the doorway, arms crossed, hair tucked behind one ear, it felt heavier than ever. She looked at me as if she already knew what I was thinking, or maybe she was just amused that I'd stopped halfway up the stairs, heart thudding in a way that wasn't entirely professional. "You're early," she said, voice smooth and deliberate, like it belonged to someone who measured every word before it left their lips. Her confidence wasn't loud. It was the quiet kind that made people lean closer without even realizing it. I wanted to. I started, then stopped because nothing I could say would make sense in the tension that had already settled between us. She smiled faintly, just a twitch at the corner of her mouth, and it felt like the first crack in a window I didn't know was closed. Her apartment smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books, a combination that somehow made the room feel intimate, even though it wasn't mine to enter. I set the box down, trying not to notice the way her sleeves fell just so over her wrists, the way the light from the window caught a glint in her eyes. I knew I shouldn't be noticing these things. I had a promise. "So, you fixed it?" I asked, nodding toward the small antique radio perched on the counter. She tilted her head, examining me like she was deciding whether I was worth the answer. "I did, but it wasn't exactly broken, was it?" Her voice held that same layered certainty, like she was teasing and challenging me at once, daring me to step closer without actually inviting it. I swallowed, aware of how my pulse had picked up pace. There was something electric in the silence that followed her words, something that wasn't just about radios or repairs. My hands itched to do something, anything, touch the box, brush past her, even just adjust my stance, but every motion seemed heavier than the last. "Thanks," I said finally, my voice low, almost swallowed by the quiet hum of the apartment. She nodded, eyes flicking to mine for a heartbeat longer than socially acceptable. And then, just like that, the moment passed, or so I thought. I reached for the box again, pretending to inspect it, pretending to be busy, but I kept catching her watching me, just slightly, as if she could see past the words I'd spoken and into the part of me that had been quiet too long. And then she did something small that I couldn't stop replaying in my mind. She brushed a strand of hair from my shoulder. Just a flick, almost dismissive, but my chest had tightened in ways that promised neither of us anything simple. I told myself to focus on the promise. I told myself to leave before it became more complicated than it already was. And yet, even as I walked down the narrow stairwell, heart still stubbornly racing, I couldn't stop thinking about the way her hand had lingered just a second too long, the way her gaze hadn't looked away. Some promises, I realized, weren't as simple as keeping them. And some glances, once caught, didn't let go. I didn't plan on staying this long. The repair job had been finished yesterday, yet somehow I found myself back at her apartment, my backpack heavier with tools I probably wouldn't need. She answered the door wearing that same casual confidence, hair pulled into a loose knot, a faint crease between her brows that made her look younger and more fragile all at once. "You came back," she said, voice careful, like stepping on a floorboard she didn't want to creak. Not an accusation, not a welcome, just a fact. "I noticed the hinge was still a little stiff," I said, shrugging, though I could feel her eyes on me, assessing, judging, maybe even testing. She stepped aside, letting me in. Her apartment smelled the same, warm polish, old paper, but now it also carried something softer, like the lingering scent of coffee she'd forgotten to clear away. I set my tools down, trying not to let my gaze linger on her hands as she moved to open a cabinet. Long fingers, careful gestures, the kind of hands that could fix something or ruin it with the slightest hesitation. We worked in silence, but the quiet wasn't empty. Every scrape of metal, every soft sigh she let escape her lips seemed amplified. I noticed the slight tremor in her fingers when she reached for a small screw, the way her shoulders tensed, then relaxed as she tried to mask it, and the brief glance she shot my way when I caught her wobble, quickly hidden behind a cough. Do you want me to hold it steady?" I asked, voice softer than intended. Her laugh came, quiet, almost like a secret. You really want to help, don't you? It wasn't teasing, not exactly. It was tentative, fragile, almost hesitant. She tilted her head, studying me, eyes narrowing with that same layered precision that made me feel like I was always being read, never fully known. I held the piece steady, trying to focus on the job, but all my attention was on her. The faint shadow under her eyes, the way her hair caught the light, the subtle sigh she tried to hide when a screw refused to turn. She was tired, more than she let on, but she didn't admit it. That vulnerability, even hinted at, pulled at something inside me I hadn't expected to feel. Careful, she murmured, brushing against my hand as she adjusted the angle. The contact was brief, almost dismissive, but it lingered in my mind far longer than it should. I realized then that our silence was loaded. Every glance, every breath, every small act of assistance carrying a weight we weren't ready to name. She was guarded, distant, but there were cracks I could see if I looked hard enough. And I wanted to, more than I probably should. When the hinge finally clicked into place, we both stepped back. I didn't move to leave. She didn't push me out. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the air between us felt charged, not with words, but with something unspoken, fragile, and impossible to ignore. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled in my throat. So I stayed quiet, letting the tension linger, letting the pull of what could be, or what shouldn't, hold us in that fragile, electric moment. The rain had started softly, tapping against the window panes in a rhythm that made the apartment feel smaller, more intimate, though I knew it wasn't mine to claim. I'd come over under the pretext of dropping off a few replacement parts for her antique cabinet, but the storm had me lingering, waiting for a natural excuse to leave. She was standing near the counter, folding a small stack of laundry, sleeves rolled up, hair damp from the drizzle she'd let in through the open window. The light was dim, the room smelling faintly of wet stone and lemon polish, and I realized I could count every freckle along her forearm if I leaned close enough. I didn't. You're still here, she said, voice low, almost hesitant, like she'd been surprised to see me, or surprised I hadn't left already. I wanted to make sure the parts fit right, I murmured, but even as I said it, I knew that wasn't the reason. She glanced at me, eyes narrowing in that quiet, precise way that made me feel like I was being examined without words. There was a hesitation there, a subtle pause before she answered, and I could tell she'd noticed the shift in the room, too. We moved around each other with careful, almost accidental closeness, elbows brushing as we adjusted the cabinet, shoulders nearly touching as we leaned over the same shelf. Every small movement carried weight. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my chest tight in a way that wasn't just from the storm. I didn't expect anyone out in this, she said finally, her tone softer, less guarded. Her hand lingered on the edge of the shelf, fingers brushing mine for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. That touch should have been meaningless. It wasn't. A sudden chime from her phone broke the tension, sharp and intrusive. She glanced at the screen and her face tightened. An ex, or maybe a friend she didn't want to disappoint. She stepped back, holding the device like a shield, and the moment snapped in an instant. I forced myself to breathe, to step away, to let the charged space between us cool. I reminded myself that I had a promise, that boundaries existed, and that I shouldn't be here, lingering over shadows and accidental touches. But when I moved toward the door, she stopped me, just for a heartbeat, her eyes holding mine longer than they should. I could see the internal conflict in her, a tension between restraint and wanting, between propriety and curiosity. My own body betrayed me in small ways, my hands tightening around the bag of tools, a cough I couldn't fully hide, a glance I lingered too long. We both knew, in that wordless exchange, how fragile the line between us was. The storm outside continued, a low rumble under the soft patter of rain, and I could feel the unspoken possibility vibrating between us. Almost, but not quite, realized. She stepped back, finally, and I followed, but neither of us moved quickly enough to erase the electricity left behind. I wanted to lean closer, to speak what we both avoided, to bridge the gap that shouldn't exist. I didn't. Not yet. The apartment was quieter than I'd ever noticed it before, though we weren't alone. She sat on the edge of the sofa, fingers tracing the seam of the cushion, eyes fixed somewhere just beyond the window. I stood near the counter, unsure if I should move closer or step back. Both felt wrong. "I don't know why I let you stay so long," she said finally, voice low, almost like she was confessing to herself. The words weren't directed at me, but they landed on me anyway. I swallowed, feeling the tension coil tighter in my chest. "I didn't want to leave," I admitted softly. My voice sounded foreign in the stillness, like it didn't belong to me. She turned slowly, eyes meeting mine. The light caught the subtle exhaustion under her lids, the way her shoulders slumped just slightly, a hint of the burden she carried quietly. "We can't keep doing this," she said, and there was no anger in her tone, only a quiet plea. It doesn't feel right anymore." I wanted to argue, to protest, but I didn't. The truth was tangled too deeply in my chest, too complicated for words. I took a small step toward her, then stopped, afraid that moving closer would break something we hadn't yet named. She watched me like she could see the hesitation threading through my movements. There was a pause long enough that the hum of the city outside became loud, enough that I could hear my own heartbeat in the quiet room. "What are we doing?" she asked finally. The question wasn't pointed. It wasn't accusatory. It was raw, trembling under the surface, and I realized she had been carrying it alone for longer than I knew. I wanted to answer, but the words tangled in my throat. I wanted to tell her that it wasn't simple, that nothing about this, about her, about me, was simple. But every time I opened my mouth, the hesitation, the weight of promises, the fear of crossing lines held me silent. She let out a breath, slow and heavy, almost like she was letting go of something too painful to carry. "You don't even know, do you?" she whispered, voice barely audible over the quiet. Her gaze fell, hands curling in her lap. I didn't. And in that moment, admitting it felt like the only honest thing I could do. She looked back up, eyes searching mine with a vulnerability that made the room smaller, the silence heavier. Maybe we were never supposed to figure this out," she said, voice breaking slightly. And yet, her fingers brushed the edge of her sleeve against her lips, a subtle, human gesture that carried more weight than any declaration. I wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the space between us, but the words wouldn't come. So I stood there, quietly observing the woman who had become impossible to ignore, feeling the charge between us, raw and unspoken, and knowing that whatever this was, it had changed us. Permanently. Then she said the line I couldn't stop hearing in my mind, long after the quiet had swallowed everything else. "I don't even know who I am anymore. Not when you're here." I came over that evening with the usual pretense, tools in hand, a task to accomplish. But she met me at the door holding something small, worn, and strangely delicate. A photograph, edges frayed, colors faded. She didn't hand it to me right away. She just stood there, eyes somewhere between the hallway and the living room, and I felt that familiar tug of curiosity, of caution. "I found this," she said finally, voice tight but quiet, as if saying it out loud made it more real. "It's from a long time ago." I nodded, unsure what to say. The way she held it made me realize she wasn't just showing me an object. She was showing me a part of herself she usually kept locked away. "I lost him," she continued, almost to herself. Her gaze didn't meet mine. And I wasn't ready to. Not then. Not ever. There was a tremor in her voice, just enough that I caught it. Just enough to make me swallow hard and look away, suddenly aware of the distance between her shoulder and mine. I wanted to reach out, to say the words that could make her feel less alone, but I stayed quiet. Instead, I leaned slightly over the counter, letting my eyes trace the lines of her hands holding the photograph, the faint curve of her lips pressed tight, the way her fingers brushed the paper almost reverently. "You remind me of him," she said softly, almost abruptly, and I flinched, not sure whether to take offense or to absorb the weight of her meaning. "Not exactly him," she clarified with a glance that didn't need words, "but something in me. Some combination of presence and attention carried echoes of what she'd lost. I nodded, heart skipping. I don't want to be a replacement, I said honestly. I want to be here. She let out a quiet laugh, fragile, like a gust of wind moving a candle flame. I know, she said. Then she did something I hadn't expected. She handed me the photograph, just briefly, enough that our fingers touched. My palm brushed hers, and I felt the small, electric charge of a shared secret, a connection neither of us wanted to fully name. I looked at the photograph, her younger self, a man standing beside her, both smiling in a way that seemed impossible to fake. And suddenly, I realized why the way she moved, spoke, even breathed, had been carrying that subtle weight all along. She wasn't hiding from me. She was hiding from herself. We both stayed still for a moment. No words, just the hum of the apartment around us, the distant clatter of the city muted by rain. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic, it was just real, honest, fragile. Then she whispered, barely audible over the quiet. I thought I could forget, but maybe I needed someone to remind me what it feels like to be seen. And in that brief, seismic moment, I knew that everything between us had shifted, not with fireworks or declarations, but with the subtle, irreversible weight of trust and revelation. The apartment smelled faintly of rain and old paper, the kind of scent that clung to quiet afternoons and made every sound feel intimate. I hadn't planned to stay long, but neither of us made a move to break the shared silence. There was a subtle understanding now, heavier than any words we could say. She was sitting on the sofa, knees tucked under her, a mug of tea warming her hands. I perched on the armrest, careful not to invade her space, yet unable to resist the small pull of proximity. We didn't talk at first. The quiet had become its own language, every glance and every breath carrying what we could not say. You're still here, she said softly, and it wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a recognition that neither of us could step away from what had begun. I didn't leave, I said, voice low, almost swallowed by the quiet. She let out a small sigh, shoulders relaxing, and for a moment I saw her fully, not just the careful composure, not just the traces of past heartbreak, but the woman she allowed herself to be when she trusted someone enough to see it. We shifted slightly, just enough that our hands brushed. I froze, not out of hesitation, but because it felt so impossibly right and inevitable, that tiny contact anchoring us in a truth we'd been dancing around. Her fingers lingered against mine, a whisper of permission and recognition. I don't think we can pretend anymore, she murmured, eyes downcast but face softened, the tension in her chest evident even in her stillness. We can't go back to whatever it was before. I nodded, unsure of what words could capture the slow, careful unraveling of everything we'd been holding in. Instead, I leaned just a fraction closer, letting my forehead brush against the side of hers, a small, deliberate gesture of presence, grounding. Her hand tightened slightly around mine, and I felt it. The quiet inevitability of connection that had grown from shared glances, tentative touches, and the slow revelation of our vulnerabilities. There was no rush, no grand declaration. Only the understanding that we were here, now, together, in a way that felt earned, fragile, and entirely ours. We stayed like that, in silence, letting the world exist outside the walls of the apartment. The storm had passed, leaving a gentle drizzle tapping against the window, a rhythmic hum that underscored the weight of the moment. Every small movement, the shift of a knee, the tilt of her head, the brush of her hand along mine, spoke louder than any words could. I realized, in that quiet, that love didn't need to be announced. It didn't need fireworks or promises written in the air. It could exist in the small, persistent spaces between two people who had earned the right to be close. Finally, she let her hand rest fully in mine, fingers lacing with a subtle certainty, and I exhaled, a long, quiet breath I didn't know I'd been holding. She looked up, eyes meeting mine, and for the first time, nothing needed to be said. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We just stayed there, together, and it was enough. It's quiet now, though the memory still hums between the walls of that apartment, like a song you can't quite place but never forget. I think about her sometimes, Maya, and the way she moved, spoke, and existed with that quiet intensity that made the ordinary feel charged. And I think about myself, the younger man who thought he could keep promises without bending, without feeling the pull of something he couldn't name. What changed? Everything and nothing. I learned that patience isn't just waiting. It's noticing, observing, and understanding someone without the need to rush them. She taught me that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's a gift, fragile and heavy at the same time. We both carried our pasts into those small, quiet moments. The regrets, the losses, the hesitations, and somehow, in acknowledging them, we found space to exist together without forcing anything. We never needed grand gestures. No proclamations, no perfect timing, no dramatic declarations. Just a hand brushed against mine, a shared cup of tea, a look that lingered too long. Those small, human moments became everything. They weren't cinematic, they were real. And in their reality, they were enough. I remember the way she leaned back on the sofa that first evening after everything shifted, the storm fading outside, and the way we just sat together without speaking. The silence carried more meaning than any conversation ever could. It taught me that love isn't always about saying, "I love you." Sometimes it's about staying, understanding, and choosing to be present in the spaces where words fail. She changed too. I saw her exhale in a way she hadn't before, allowing herself to trust again, to feel without the constant weight of the past. There was a softness in her gaze, a willingness to let someone in, even when logic and fear told her otherwise. And that subtle change was more beautiful than any outward display could ever have been. I carry those moments with me, tucked into the quiet corners of my mind. Every glance, every whispered pause, every accidental brush of fingers. They remind me that human connection doesn't need perfection. It needs honesty, presence, and the courage to acknowledge the truth between two people, even if it's inconvenient or messy. Sometimes I wonder if she thinks about it too. If she remembers the way silence could speak louder than touch, or how proximity could carry unspoken words we never had to say. And even if she doesn't, I know I do. The story isn't about endings or beginnings. It's about what happens in between. The slow pull, the careful observation, the eventual collapse into something quietly undeniable. It's about the tiny sparks that linger long after the storm has passed. And if this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?